Mr. Speaker, I wish to have the bill shortly entitled the Freedom of Information Bill 2015 read a second time. You may recall, Mr. Speaker, that this bill was first presented to the National Assembly on the 15th of September 2015. Since then, the bill has been the subject of an extensive public consultation process, and it has attracted a number of significant contributions which should assist in the process of transforming the bill to attain maximum effectiveness within our current system. Mr. Speaker, the bill before the National Assembly today is intended to usher in what is anticipated would be a new level of openness and transparency. In that vein, the enactment of Freedom of Information law to provide for a regulatory framework for public access to certain information is important at this juncture. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that we are well on the way in achieving the government's legislative goals, and that there is undoubtedly an increased emphasis on issues of good governance, transparency, and accountability in recent times in our federation. The enactment, the implementation, and application of Freedom of Information legislation would mark a new era of openness and greater transparency in our country. Mr. Speaker, it represents a paradigm shift in governance that would better ensure that citizens of St. Kitts and Nevis can more effectively enjoy the right to access information. Mr. Speaker, this right to information appears to have been given some recognition under Section 12 of our Constitution. Section 12 of the Constitution provides for the protection of freedom of expression. According to subsection 1, except with his or her own consent, a person shall not be hindered in the enjoyment of his or her freedom of expression, including freedom to receive ideas and information without interference. Subsection 2, Mr. Speaker, sets out the limitations to that freedom and explains that nothing contained in or done under the authority of any law shall be held to be inconsistent with or in contravention of that freedom, to the extent that the law in question makes provision that is reasonably required in the interests of defense, public safety, public order, public morality, or public health. Mr. Speaker, these exceptions under subsection 2 of our Constitution also applies if a law contains provisions that are reasonably required for the purpose of protecting the reputations, rights, and freedoms of other persons or the private lives of persons concerned in legal proceedings, in preventing the disclosure of information received in confidence, in maintaining the authority and independence of the courts, or regulating telephony, telegraphy, posts, wireless broadcasting, or television. Mr. Speaker, the limitations that are set out under the same subsection 2 would also apply if a law makes provision that imposes restrictions upon public officers that are reasonably required for the proper performance of their functions, to the extent that it is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society. It is anticipated that this proposed bill would be a vital tool in promoting government accountability. It should also be a very powerful tool in the fight against corruption. It should also be issuing this new sense of openness. Hence, the bill should be more effectively facilitate public participation in national decision-making and debates, whilst it enhances the credibility of the government. Mr. Speaker, with the introduction of this new approach to the sharing of information, we anticipate that naturally there would be a period of transition and that there would be a number of issues and concerns relating to the actual implementation of the legislation. This may require us to come back to this National Assembly from time to time to make appropriate adjustments. One of the most important concerns for proper administration of this legislation is the cost of preparing the government for its implementation. In that regard, Mr. Speaker, the government is prepared to make the necessary investments that would be required to fully give life to this law. It may take some time, Mr. Speaker. However, proper and adequate freedom of information law is undermined by weak mechanisms for access and enforcement of legislation such as this. In that regard, the current state of record keeping and record management systems in the Federation would have to be incrementally and progressively be addressed and improved. In short term, it's this. Our government departments need to get ready for the implementation of this bill. We collect a lot of data, a lot of information every day, whether at the ports, the passport office. Every government department collects information and data. And we have to have proper record management systems in place. We have to have it stored properly in order for us to be able to respond legitimately and quickly within the ambit of this new legislation that we are coming to the House with today. Mr. Speaker, we must also bear in mind that in this period of transition, we would be shifting from a culture of secrecy to one of openness and transparency and accountability. Very often, our public servants have a sense of propriety of the information they have. The state owns this information, and the government is now being open to the sense of being open and moving forward. And I will speak a little later to the concept of open information, open data, of where the government would want to introduce more proactive policies to be able to dovetail with the freedom of information legislation, to be able to make us better able to put forward data that the government has collected and is collecting on an ongoing basis. The issue, though, Mr. Speaker, is that in small jurisdictions like ours, this particular issue would require a considerable amount of training in order to circumvent breaches of confidentiality and to strike an appropriate balance between the desire to make information available and the duty to protect the privacy of individuals. This change would not happen overnight, but should be taken in measured strides. By enacting this legislation, the people of the Federation would have taken the first step, the first big step towards accomplishing this goal. Mr. Speaker, another important consideration, or another important concern, we may say, relates to issues of national security. In this current international environment, with threats of terrorism, organized crime, and cybercrime, our national security must be safeguarded. It is therefore critically important to ensure that even within a more open system of government, a more open system of governance, a more open environment that we are trying to engender, that certain specific and narrow categories of information are properly identified and withheld where necessary in order to protect legitimate national security interests. Notwithstanding these concerns, Mr. Speaker, we should in time be able to effectively implement the Freedom of Information legislation. In Jamaica, for example, within the first 2 years of the commencement of similar legislation, agencies were granted either full or partial access to the requested information. This rate of fulfillment was better than the average international experience for the first 2 years of most countries, and that includes far wealthier countries than Jamaica, such as the United Kingdom and South Africa. In the US, we hear rates as low as 33% of access or favorable responses to requests. Based on the encouraging example, however, out of Jamaica, we are very hopeful that the process of full implementation of the law would in time be properly accomplished. Mr. Speaker, you may recall that on a number of previous occasions before 2015, similar bills were brought to the National Assembly. I can recall even as far back as 2006. As a matter of fact, on the 26th of October 2006, some 12 years ago, when a similar bill was read a first time in the National Assembly. Those bills, however, were never debated or enacted. Mr. Speaker, the legislation will require some work and the investment of resources. We are fully aware of this, and we feel prepared to put the laws on our statute books and to begin the process of full implementation. And in that regard, Mr. Speaker, this bill is based on the same model bill prepared by the OECS Secretariat way back in 2004. The model was prepared to reflect best practices and had been extensively reviewed by OECS member states. Unfortunately, most have not really taken that step forward to enact legislation, or those who have not really fully operationalized the law. Mr. Speaker, we believe that to do so in our context, in our national context, that a number of substantive changes would have to be made to the bill to bolster effectiveness within the Federation, and that a number of changes, these changes, would reflect the numerous comments received from our nationals, from our citizens regarding this bill. The bill initially indicated that it would generally promote maximum disclosure of information in the public interest. It would also guarantee a right for everyone to access to certain information. Additionally, the bill would provide for effective mechanisms which would seek to secure the right to information and for related matters. The long title of the bill would be amended to better reflect the modified version of the bill, and we have followed the UK legislation and reworked the long title. The new long title would state, "A bill to make provision for the disclosure of information held by public bodies or by persons providing services for them and for connected purposes." This change to the long title is important, Mr. Speaker, because it speaks to the scope and ambit of the bill. And with this new long title, private bodies which had been envisaged would have been in the OECS model would generally be excluded from the bill, except where they provide a public function. The bill seeks to give practical effect to the freedom of access to information, or the freedom to access information, which is articulated under the Constitution. The preliminary sections of the bill, that is, clauses 1 to 3, provide for the commencement of the bill, the interpretation of words used throughout the bill, and for the application of the bill. By virtue of Clause 3 of the bill, the provisions of the bill are binding on the Crown. In that vein, Mr. Speaker, the bill would provide everyone with an enforceable right to access information held by public bodies upon submission of a request. The main changes under this section would be the insertion of a definition for the term information. In that regard, under the bill, information means documents, records, data, maps, photographs, or any other information recorded in any form. The definition to the expression private body would be deleted, since, like in the UK and in Antigua and Barbuda, this bill would apply to public bodies or bodies carrying out a public function. We have also introduced, Mr. Speaker, a definition for the term vexatious to guide the information officers when deciding if a request for information is one that is vexatious. A vexatious request for information would be a request that is unreasonable and is made mainly to cause frustration or annoyance. Under Part 2, Mr. Speaker, the bill would be amended to exclude private bodies, except where such a body carries out a public function. Part 2 also generally provides for the right to access information held by public bodies. According to Clause 4, every person shall have the right to freedom of information, including the right to access information held by public bodies, subject to the provisions of this Act. There are time limits for responding, or the time limits for responding have also been extended for better practical application. The response will now be within 30 working days rather than 20 days that were introduced at the first reading. And in emergency cases, within 7 working days rather than the very limited 48 hours. Part 3 of the bill, Mr. Speaker, provides some measures to promote openness. Provision is therefore made for the compilation of a guide by the Information Commissioner to facilitate the effective exercise of rights pursuant to the bill. The bill will also provide for the appointment for each public, or the bill also provided for the appointment by each public body. However, Clause 17 would be amended to be more in line with our reality here in St. Kitts and Nevis. And I should just say that the bill also provided for the appointment of an information officer by each public body. An information officer was what was being proposed by each department, each public body. However, in clause 17, this would now be amended to be more in line with our reality here in St. Kitts and Nevis. Rather than requiring an unreasonable number of persons to man the implementation of this legislation, within each separate government department and agency, we believe and we have agreed with the views submitted that a more centralized agency with trained experts in one location would be easier for the purposes of the general public. Just so I make that very clear, the bill that has been circulated envisages that every government department or ministry would have an information officer. It would become onerous and expensive for the government to have to recruit numerous individuals to pay them to work in these departments. And we say that we would see that a central unit with a reduced number of information officers will now be mandated to liaise with the various ministries and departments so that it's more in keeping with our budgetary considerations in a small jurisdiction like ours. We intend to operationalize this, Mr. Speaker, and things like such we have mentioned are deterrents, and may well have been deterrents in the past in trying to contemplate how to put this thing into operation. And we are trying to find ways that would be effective in getting the implementation of this piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, these information officers would be appointed into the public service rather than have the commissioner appoint them himself or herself. Mr. Speaker, additionally, under Part 3, the bill places a number of positive obligations on public bodies, including a requirement to publish certain types of information and to maintain their records in good order, in accordance with the code of practice to be published by the Commissioner in consultation with the Director of Archives after appropriate consultation with interested parties. Circulate. Will circulate.
Oh, a point of information. I was just about to request of the mover that he's speaking of a number of changes which we do not have before us, so that we could have the opportunity to be able to debate on those before we get into committee. So if those changes could be circulated.
To me, there's nothing we can do about that right now. The move of the bill is presenting the bill, and clearly he's indicating there'll be some amendments. And so I would propose that the thing to do would be to make notes as the mover presents.
The members to assist them. I would say that last one, I'll go over it again because I think you have projected that you didn't really get the answer. I think the idea is that the OECS, the general legislation that had been tabled in our parliament in 2006, which had been circulated as throughout the OECS by OECS Secretariat, we say is too broad for a small jurisdiction like ours. And it will be onerous and cumbersome to have appointed information officers, salaried information officers in every ministry and in every department. An officer can be designated as a point person, but to say that that person will be employed becomes cumbersome and difficult to introduce. And what we are saying, though, is that we understand that you do need to have a point where complaints or requests can be made, not just to the Commissioner of Information, the Information Commissioner, but where you want to have actively work being done or liaison with individual ministries or individual departments. And so we envisage an Office of Information unit or that will be a focal point to assist and to which the request will go, and then in turn we deal with the various ministries. I think, Mr. Speaker, I accept that they may not have seen this before, but I also confess, that, Mr. Speaker, that not everybody has seen it either. You know what I mean? Well, and so we will debate it properly. I expect a vigorous debate, because we would want to know why it is that after 12 years of having to have a first reading in 2006, nothing of this nature had been done. And I suspect it could be similar concerns of this nature, hurdles in terms of the expense of implementation and those issues that we now address in this bill to ensure an effective implementation of this bill. It's one thing to talk about it, but we are committed to having it brought into this House and operationalized in our country. Mr. Speaker, by virtue of Clause 21, every public body is under an obligation to train its officials on the right to information and the effective implementation of the bill. We would expect reports by an information officer to the Commissioner on the activities of the public body pursuant to the bill are provided for in Clause 22. And additionally, by virtue of Part 4, the bill recognizes a number of exceptions in accordance with international best practice, health and safety, law enforcement, defense, and policy formulation. These exceptions, however, Mr. Speaker, are subject to a strict public interest override, and for some, overall time limits. Mr. Speaker, in Part 5 of the bill, it provides for the appointment of an independent information commissioner with the power to review any refusal to disclose and with a general mandate to promote the goals of this piece of legislation. The commissioner may receive complaints and undertake his or her own monitoring of government compliance. The commissioner may also require bodies to disclose information and may even impose fines for willful failures to comply with the law. This part of the bill was modified extensively, Mr. Speaker, to reflect the practices in our federation. And in that regard, the commissioner would be appointed by the Governor General, acting on the advice of the Prime Minister and after consultation with the Premier of Nevis and the Leader of the Opposition. And he or she shall be appointed on such terms and conditions as may be specified in the instrument of his or her appointment. His or her removal would be for physical or mental incapacity or misconduct. And similar to his or her appointment, his removal would be occasioned by the Governor General acting on the recommendation of the Prime Minister and after consultation with the Premier and the Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, a person shall not be appointed Commissioner if he or she is a member of the National Assembly, holds or is acting in a public office, is an undischarged bankrupt, having been declared bankrupt under any law, holds an official office in or is an employee of a political party, or has been convicted of a violent crime or crime of dishonesty or theft. In relation to his or her independence, Mr. Speaker, the Commissioner shall not be subject to the direction or control of any person or authority. Mr. Speaker, Part 7 of the bill provides for a person who may disclose information to the Commissioner on wrongdoing by a public authority concerning a number of matters. This protection would be afforded, or it provides for the protection of such a person, and this will be provided under the provision of the bill in circumstances where a person has acted in good faith. Part 8 of the bill, Mr. Speaker, seeks to provide protection to those who disclose information in good faith pursuant to a request, and at the same time imposes criminal liability on those who willfully obstruct access to information or who destroy records. Mr. Speaker, the power of the Minister to make regulations to give effect to the purpose of the bill is provided for in Part 9 of the bill. Mr. Speaker, our government is very mindful of the implications of this landmark legislation. It's iconic because in our country, it now sees us take an important stride forward in being able to make us more open, more accountable, and where we hope that in so doing, we can garner the trust and confidence of our citizens. We feel we are justified in taking this step because it allows us to show that when we made this promise on our campaign trail, one in which we touted the benefits of good governance, in which we saw that it made us more free as a people, that our governance of democracy in a democratic style would be redound to our benefit in terms of economic advancement. Investors would have more and greater confidence in us, and our people would have more and greater satisfaction. It is a good thing we do today by bringing this bill, tabling and having it debated. I expect that we will have a vigorous debate, but at the end, we would have made a significant change in our country in allowing every citizen to be able to have that general right to access information held by its government. It will have an important effect on all of us who are public officers, that we are now more likely to be accountable, and our transparency and openness should eliminate, reduce, curtail questions of corruption as we move forward to have a better St. Kitts and Nevis. I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that we would want, as a government, to implement one of the strong recommendations from one of our public officers who provided for us a framework for an open information policy where our government should be more proactive in providing information. We have already, in this administration, made significant strides in that regard. Our Prime Minister has been relentless in making sure that every month he holds a national press conference and opens himself and his government to questions by the media and to the country as a whole. Our publication, regular publication of our information services dictate what we do. And what we also will do, we believe, under this policy that is being crafted and that we hope will get the stamp of approval from our cabinet, is that we see government departments increasing in the way in which we now use technology to disseminate information on their own activities and actions. So that, for instance, Mr. Speaker, just last Thursday, the Department of Intellectual Property that falls under the Ministry of Justice and Legal Affairs launched for the first time a web page on intellectual property that informs those that access its business and others of what they do and how to make applications, get information, whether it is for trademarks that have traditionally been the business of the Intellectual Property Office, or whether we now talk about copyrights and more intellectual property, where young people who, for instance, are creative, our singers, our songwriters, our musicians, can now have that aspect of engaging with this government department on how to become, as it was, more economically viable. Other ministries and departments have followed suit and will continue to follow suit. In the Ministry of Justice and Legal as a whole, we have already engaged and are preparing to launch our own webpage to make our data open, to be more open in our information, so that in short order we would be making weekly publications of court calendars of what matters are before the court and in public settings. We would be engaging in terms of our legal aid clinics around the island that would be available to the people, that we would be proactive, as I say, in letting the public and our citizens know what we do. And so there needs to be this shift in our country in which the government reaches out to encourage the public to also reach out to the government and be closer in terms of being more citizen-centric in terms of the relationships. And we say that this open policy, open information policy, open data policy that the government will be pursuing dovetails with the concept of the freedom of information that we talk about, in which the public, citizens, can now access information within a framework, a legal framework that is now being debated and put forward in this country. And Mr. Speaker, with those few words, or those many words, I would want to invite our colleagues to lend their support to this important piece of legislation, and that it will see safe passage into our laws of the land. May it please you, Mr. Speaker.